The word hit Birdie Shelton like a fist to the sternum, and she stood in the middle of Cyrus Langston's kitchen with her hands trembling at her sides, staring at him across a scarred wooden table as if he had just confessed to something unforgivable. "A mother," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, and the word tasted like both a prayer and a wound on her tongue. "You want me to be a mother to your children." Cyrus stood on the other side of that table with his hat in his hands and his jaw set hard, the kind of jaw that did not move easily, the kind that had been clenched against grief and survival, and 3 long years of raising 2 small children alone in the middle of the New Mexico territory. His eyes, dark as creek water at dusk, did not flinch from hers. He was not a man who looked away from hard things. "I won't dress it up as something it isn't," he said, and his voice was low and rough, like boots on gravel. "I need a woman who can look after my children. Ruth and Henry need someone. They need stability. They need someone here when I'm out on the range. I run close to 400 head of cattle and I cannot do both." Birdie felt something crack open inside her chest. It was not anger, though there was anger in there, sharp and bright. It was something deeper, something she had carried for years before she ever set foot in Cimarron, New Mexico, before she ever answered that advertisement in the back of a Kansas City newspaper, before she ever climbed onto a westbound train with one trunk and a heart full of desperate, hidden hope. It was the old secret she had never told anyone, the secret she had buried under layers of practicality and composure. She had always wanted a family. Not just wanted it the way a woman might want a new dress or a warmer winter coat. She had wanted it the way a drowning woman wants air, with her whole body, with the marrow of her bones. And now this man, this broad-shouldered, grief-worn, quietly fierce man, was standing across from her offering her exactly that in the most unromantic way she had ever heard in her 26 years of living. He had not asked if she could love him. He had not asked if she might come to. He had laid out the arrangement like a business transaction, like the land deed she had seen posted on the wall of the Cimarron courthouse, and something about that precision, that blunt and terrible honesty, made the cracks in her chest widen until she felt the whole secret spilling out before she could stop it. "Mr. Langston," she said, and her voice broke on his name in a way she had not planned. "I have always wanted a family." The silence that fell between them then was the loudest thing Birdie had ever heard in her life. She had not arrived in Cimarron looking for love. That was the truth she had told herself every mile of the journey west, every rattle and lurch of the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway line through the brown flats of Kansas, and into the copper-dusted hills of New Mexico territory. She had told herself she was being sensible, practical. She was 26 years old, which was old enough in 1882 to understand that the world did not often arrange itself around a woman's secret wishes. The advertisement had been small and plainly worded. It had read, "Widower, cattle rancher, Cimarron, New Mexico territory, seeks capable woman for marriage. 2 children, ages 4 and 6. Must be willing to manage household and assist with the upbringing of said children. Respond to C. Langston, Box 14, Cimarron Post Office." There had been nothing about love in it, nothing about companionship or warmth or the particular loneliness that settles into a house where only one adult lives, just capability and willingness and the basic architecture of a practical arrangement. Birdie had responded to it anyway. She had written 3 drafts, each one beginning in a different way, each one crossing out any sentence that sounded too eager or too raw. She had settled on something measured and composed, had described herself honestly as a schoolteacher from Kansas City with strong domestic skills and no living family of her own, had folded the letter and posted it before she could lose her nerve, and had then spent 2 weeks convincing herself that nothing would come of it. Something had come of it. A reply had arrived written in a hand that was careful but not elegant, a man's hand that pressed the pen firmly to the paper as if every word were a decision rather than merely a letter. Cyrus Langston had written that he appreciated her honesty, that he had 2 children, a girl named Ruth who was 6 and a boy named Henry who was 4. That the ranch was called the Double L, that it sat on 1,000 acres along the Cimarron River, that the work was hard and the winters cold, but that the land was good land, and a woman with her own measure of determination would not find it wanting. He had not said anything about himself. Not really. He had not said how old he was, had not described himself in any way, had not mentioned his wife except in the single word widower that had appeared in the advertisement. He had not said he was lonely, though Birdie had read the letter 4 times and found the loneliness between every line, quiet as smoke, persistent as drought. She had written back. He had written back. They had exchanged 6 letters over the course of 2 months, each one a little more honest than the last, though there was a careful distance kept in all of them, the distance of 2 people who had each learned the hard way not to want too much from anyone. Birdie had learned it in a particular way that she had not put in her letters. She had not told Cyrus Langston about her dark past, about the childhood spent in a Kansas City boarding house after her mother died of cholera when Birdie was 7 years old, and her father had quietly disappeared into the West, never to return. She had not told him about the years she had spent watching other children go home to families at the end of the school day, while she sat in the matron's parlor and read books until dark. She had not told him about the young man she had nearly married at 20, a clerk named Thomas Waller who had seemed kind and steady, until it turned out that he had a wife already in St. Louis, a secret he had kept so smoothly and so completely that Birdie had felt not just heartbroken but foolish, the kind of foolish that scars. She had not told Cyrus any of that. But she had packed all of it into her trunk alongside her wool dresses and her teaching primers and her mother's silver hairbrush, the one thing she still had from before, and she had carried it all west with her. The train had arrived in Cimarron on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, 1882, and Birdie had stepped onto the platform into a wind that smelled of pine resin and dust and distance. Cimarron in the fall was a rough sort of beautiful, the kind of place that did not try to charm you, that simply stood there with its adobe walls and its wide dirt streets and its backdrop of mountains going purple in the morning light, and either you saw something worth staying for or you did not. Birdie had seen something. She had not been sure yet what it was, only that it made her breath catch in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. Cyrus Langston had been waiting at the far end of the platform. She had known him immediately, though she could not have said why. He was tall, close to 6 feet, with the kind of lean, work-hardened build that came from years of physical labor rather than any conscious cultivation of it. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, which surprised her because she had not known his age from the letters and had imagined him somehow ageless. He was 34, she would learn later. The gray at his temples was grief, not years. He had gone gray in the months after his wife Clara had died of childbed fever following Henry's birth, 4 years ago now, and the gray had simply stayed. He had held his hat in his hands when he approached her, which she noted. Some men did not bother with courtesy. He had said, "Miss Shelton." And when she said yes, he had nodded once as if confirming something to himself and then said, "I'll take your trunk." It had not been romantic. It had been functional and a little tense, the two of them walking side by side to the wagon where a boy and a girl sat waiting with very large, very serious eyes. Ruth had been the first to speak. Ruth, who was 6 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's, from what Birdie would later gather, copper-colored hair, had looked Birdie up and down with an expression of profound and unsettling assessment and said, "You are smaller than I thought you would be." Henry, 4 years old and round-cheeked and still carrying the last traces of baby fat in his hands, had said nothing at all. He had simply stared at Birdie with enormous brown eyes, and then reached out one small hand and touched the green ribbon on her traveling bonnet, very gently, as if she were something delicate that might break. That small touch, that tentative and wordless reaching of Henry Langston's 4-year-old hand, had undone something in Birdie Shelton that had taken her 19 years of lonely living to build up. She had felt it come loose like a knot worked free, and she had looked at this small boy's face and felt the full weight of everything she had always wanted settle onto her like a shawl. She had smiled at him. He had smiled back, uncertain and sweet. Ruth had observed this exchange and said, "He doesn't talk much," as if providing useful information, and Cyrus had said, "Ruth," in a low warning voice that Ruth had responded to with an expression of complete innocence that was already, at 6, impressively practiced. Birdie had thought, riding in the wagon out of Cimarron and toward the mountains with the wind in her face and 2 children pressed against her sides and a silent, careful man on the seat beside her, "I could love them. I could love them so easily it frightens me." She had not thought about loving Cyrus then. She had not given herself permission for that. The Double L Ranch was everything the letters had suggested and more. It sat in a valley along the Cimarron River, where the grass grew thick and green right up to the water, and the cottonwood trees turned gold in October and rattled their leaves in the wind like the sound of distant applause. The house itself was a 2-story adobe and timber structure, solid and plain, built for function, with a wide porch across the front and a kitchen that took up most of the ground floor. There was a wood stove and a dry sink and a good table and chairs, and the curtains at the windows were thin and sun-faded, but had clearly been hung by someone who wanted the place to feel like a home rather than a shelter. Clara Langston had hung those curtains. Birdie had understood this without being told. She had spent the first week simply learning the rhythms of the place. She learned where everything was kept, learned that Ruth needed to be reminded 3 times about any given task before she would do it without argument, learned that Henry followed her from room to room with a quiet devotion that she found both heartbreaking and wonderful. She learned that Cyrus rose before dawn and came in for supper at dusk and said very little in between, not out of coldness, but out of a deep and habitual self-containment that had the quality of protection rather than indifference. She learned that he watched her, not in any way that was threatening or untoward. In the way of a man who has learned to observe quietly, who had spent 4 years reading the world carefully for danger and difficulty, who now found himself in the unexpected position of having a woman in his house again, and was trying to understand what she was. She was not Clara. She understood that he was measuring her against Clara without meaning to, and she did not resent it because she thought that if she had loved someone and lost them, she would do the same thing. She simply tried to be herself, fully and without pretense, tried to let him see that she was capable and honest and genuinely attached to his children, and hoped that would be enough. It had not been simple. There had been friction in those first weeks. Not hostile friction, but the natural grinding of 2 people with fully formed personalities and deep-seated habits trying to share a space and a life. Cyrus was used to making every decision alone. Birdie was used to no one asking her opinion about anything. They had had several quiet, controlled disagreements, mostly about the children's routine, about how much latitude Ruth should be allowed versus how much discipline she needed, about whether Henry's silence was something to worry about or simply something to wait out. One evening in the 3rd week, Cyrus had come in from the range later than usual, and Birdie had kept supper warm on the stove and put the children to bed, and when he came in she had simply set his plate on the table and poured him coffee without comment. He had sat down and eaten in silence for a while and then looked up at her and said, "You're not afraid of quiet." "No," she had said. "I was raised in it." Something in his face had shifted slightly, a barely perceptible softening, and he had said, "My wife used to fill every room with talking. I missed it for a long time." Birdie had not been sure whether this was a comparison meant to diminish her or simply an honest statement of grief, and she had decided to treat it as the latter. She had said, "Do you still miss it?" He had thought about this for a moment, a full and honest moment of consideration, and then said, "Yes, but I think I've made a kind of peace with quiet." They had sat in the kitchen after that for a while without speaking, and it had not been uncomfortable. It had been the first genuinely companionable silence Birdie could remember sharing with another adult, and she had carried it with her to bed that night and held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile and valuable. She had not let herself think about what it meant. She had reminded herself of Thomas Waller. She had reminded herself of the advertisement, of the plainness of its purpose, of the word arrangement that lived in the back of her mind like a warning sign. But then had come the morning she found Henry crying at the kitchen table, really crying, the deep and helpless crying of a very small child who does not have the words for what is wrong. And she had knelt down in front of him and gathered him into her arms and held him, and he had grabbed hold of her with both small hands the way a drowning person grabs at anything solid, and she had felt his whole body shaking against hers, and she had said very softly, "I've got you. I've got you, sweetheart," over and over until the shaking stopped. She had not heard Cyrus come into the kitchen. She had not known he was there until she looked up and found him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and an expression on his face that she had no name for, something raw and devastated and grateful all at once, something that had clearly been living underneath all that careful composure for a very long time. He had turned and walked back outside without a word. Birdie had stayed on the kitchen floor with Henry in her arms for a long time after that. Later that same day, Ruth had come to find Birdie in the vegetable garden where she was working, and had said, without preamble, as was Ruth's way, "Henry cries sometimes because he doesn't remember our mother. He only knows she's gone. He's sad about something he can't even describe." Birdie had set down her trowel and looked at this 6-year-old girl, this child who carried her grief with such fierce practicality, and said, "And you, do you remember her?" Ruth had been quiet for a moment, which was unusual. Then she said, "I remember her hair. It was the same color as mine. She used to let me brush it." A pause. "I remember she smelled like lavender." Birdie had felt the grief of it settle into her own chest, making room for itself beside her own old sorrows. She had reached out and put her hand on Ruth's shoulder, and Ruth, who was not given to physical affection, had stood very still and allowed it, which Birdie understood was a great concession. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Birdie said. "Papa never talks about her," Ruth said. "I think it hurts him too much." Birdie had nodded and picked up her trowel and said, "Maybe someday he'll be ready to." She had not known then how right she was or how soon. The evening that changed everything came 3 weeks after her arrival, in late October, when the first real cold had descended on the valley, and the fire in the kitchen stove needed feeding every few hours. The children were in bed, and Birdie was mending one of Henry's shirts by lamplight when Cyrus came in from a late check of the stock, bringing the cold with him in the collar of his coat and the redness of his cheeks. He had sat down across from her at the table, which was unusual. Usually he went directly to his study or to bed. He had poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher and sat there turning it in his hands, and Birdie had kept mending because she had learned that Cyrus said things he needed to say more readily when her attention was not directly on him. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She had kept her eyes on the mending. "All right." "This arrangement," he said, and there was something in the word arrangement that made her hands still without her permission. "It isn't what I wanted for my children. What I wanted was for their mother to be alive. I want you to understand that I know this isn't ideal for you or for them." Birdie set the shirt down very carefully. She looked at him. "Mr. Langston," she said, "I answered an advertisement. I understood exactly what I was coming to. I didn't come here under any illusions." "I know," he said, "but I've been watching you with them, and I need to say something that I should have said before you came." He paused, and the pause had the weight of something that had been held back for a long time. "I won't pretend the practicalities aren't part of this. My children need a mother. I meant that when I wrote it, and I mean it now. But I want you to know that I don't see you as simply a hired arrangement. What you've done for Henry this past week," he stopped. His jaw tightened. He tried again. "What you've done for both of them, that isn't something that can be paid for or contracted for, and I see it. And I'm grateful." Birdie was very quiet for a moment. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Then she said the thing she had not meant to say, the thing that had been living inside her since the very first day, the secret she had carried from Kansas City like hidden cargo. She said, "I have always wanted a family. My whole life. I never had one to speak of, and I wanted one so much it frightened me. And I know that is not a reason to build a life on, and I know this isn't the storybook version of how a family is supposed to come together. But I want you to know that Ruth and Henry are not a duty to me. They are not a task I am completing. They are already," her voice broke just slightly. She steadied it. "They are already something very close to the thing I thought I might never have." The silence after that was different from all the silences before it. It was the kind of silence that comes after a secret is told, full of rearranged air. Cyrus looked at her for a long moment with those dark, careful eyes, and then he said very quietly, "Tell me about your family, the one you grew up in." And Birdie, who had kept this locked away for her whole adult life, had taken a breath and told him. All of it. The cholera, the boarding house, the disappearing father, the long years of being a guest in other people's homes and lives, the schoolteacher years during which she had poured everything she could not have into the children she taught. Thomas Waller and the betrayal of it, the way it had made her feel that wanting things led to being made a fool of. She told him all of it in the low lamplight with the fire crackling and the cold pressing at the windows, and he listened, fully and without interruption, with the particular quality of attention he had that made her feel that every word was being received and considered rather than simply heard. When she was done, he said, "I'm sorry. For all of it. And you," she said, because it seemed right to ask, because they had reached some threshold in this conversation and retreating back across it seemed like a waste of something precious. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Clara. Her name was Clara Renfrew when I met her. We grew up in the same county in Texas. I'd known her my whole life. We married when I was 23 and she was 21. When Henry was born he stopped, started again. She didn't survive the birth. Henry was fine, she was not. There was nothing to be done about it, the doctor said. Sometimes it just goes wrong," he said. A muscle moved in his jaw. "Henry is 4 years old, and sometimes I look at him, and I still feel guilty that he lived and she didn't. I know that isn't rational. I know it isn't fair to him. But the feeling is there." Birdie reached across the table without thinking and put her hand over his where it rested on the wood. He looked down at it with an expression of such naked surprise that it was almost painful to see, as if the touch of another person's hand in comfort was something he had entirely forgotten could happen. He did not pull away. He turned his hand over slowly, and for a moment, just a moment, his fingers closed around hers, and Birdie felt it in every part of her body, that brief warm pressure, that wordless acknowledgement. Then he had released her hand and cleared his throat and stood up and said good night in a voice that was carefully steady, and walked out of the kitchen. And Birdie had sat alone at the table for a long time after he was gone, her hand still warm where he had held it, feeling as if something enormous had shifted in the landscape of her life, and she was only beginning to understand the new geography. The following weeks were different. Not dramatically so, not with any grand declaration or overt change in how they spoke to each other. But the distance had altered. There was something easier between them now, some compression of the formal space they had maintained, so that when they sat at the same table it felt like proximity rather than proximity being carefully maintained. He had begun to ask her opinion about things. Small things at first, whether Ruth should be allowed to ride the smaller horse unaccompanied to the creek, whether Henry needed to see the doctor about his lingering cough, what she thought about hiring an extra hand for the winter roundup. She had given her opinions honestly, and he had listened to them genuinely, and sometimes acted on them, and sometimes explained why he would not, and all of it had felt like respect, which was something Birdie had not received from a man in a long time and found unexpectedly nourishing. Ruth had begun to warm to her in the careful, conditional way of a child who has learned that people go away. She had started coming to Birdie's room in the evenings after supper, ostensibly to ask practical questions about her schoolwork, as Birdie had taken on the role of her teacher in addition to everything else. But really, Birdie thought, just to be in the same room as another woman. She would sit at the foot of the bed and watch Birdie brush her hair and ask questions that ranged from the thoroughly practical to the deeply philosophical, often within the same sentence. One evening she had asked what it felt like to be lonely, and Birdie had set down the hairbrush and thought carefully about it, and said that loneliness felt like standing outside a lit window on a cold night, seeing something you wanted but not knowing how to get inside. Ruth had considered this with her characteristic seriousness and then said, "Papa looks like that sometimes, like he's standing outside." Birdie had felt that observation like a hand closing around something in her chest. Henry had, by the fourth week, taken to climbing into Birdie's lap whenever she sat down, with the complete and cheerful lack of self-consciousness of a child who has simply decided where he belongs. He still spoke very little, but he had begun to say her name, or his version of it, which came out as something between Birdie and Birdie, and she found that she loved the sound of it with an intensity that she could no longer entirely dismiss as merely affectionate. She had found her answer to the question she had been asking herself since Kansas City. She had not come here looking for love, and she had found it anyway, found it in the small, sticky hands of a 4-year-old boy and the brilliant, defensive mind of a 6-year-old girl. And it was the realest thing she had ever felt, realer even than the quieter, more complicated thing she was not yet permitting herself to fully name with respect to their father. The first real crisis came in early November. A man arrived at the ranch on a gray horse, a man named Harlan Cross, who Birdie had not met before but whose arrival clearly agitated Cyrus in a way she had not seen him agitated before. She had been in the kitchen when the rider came and Cyrus had gone out to meet him on the porch, and she had not been able to hear the conversation clearly, only the tones of it, which were tense and tight-wound. Cyrus had come back inside with a look on his face that he was working very hard to contain, and he had said without preamble, "There may be trouble." "What kind?" she asked, because she was not a woman who needed things softened. He had explained. Harlan Cross was a land agent who had been working, on behalf of a combine of Eastern investors, to acquire land in the Cimarron Valley. He had been systematically pressuring smaller ranchers and homesteaders to sell, and several had, and now the Double L was one of the last significant holdings that had not signed over. Cross had come to make an offer, which was really a threat wearing the clothing of an offer, of the kind Birdie had read about in newspapers but never seen up close. "He said if I don't sell, they'll find other ways to make things difficult," Cyrus said, and there was a flatness in his voice that was more frightening than anger. "Cutting off water rights, disputes over the eastern boundary line. They've done it to others." Birdie thought about what this meant for Ruth and Henry. About the house and the land and the 400 head of cattle and everything that Cyrus had built. She thought about hidden motives and forced choices and the particular injustice of a system that used legal instruments as weapons against the people who had actually done the work of building something. "Do you have a lawyer?" she asked. He looked at her. "In Cimarron? No. There's a territorial court in Santa Fe," she said. "And I believe there are land grants and water rights on record that predate any of this man's instruments. If the original deed is sound, it is," he said. "I have it. Then we need someone who knows how to use it." She met his gaze steadily. "This is your land, Cyrus, your children's land. I won't have anyone taking it without a fight." He had looked at her for a moment with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where his defenses shifted slightly and the thing underneath them, something warm and alive, came briefly visible. He said, "We. I beg your pardon. You said we won't have anyone taking it." He said it quietly, with a specificity that was not confrontational but was very deliberate. Birdie held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "I did." He had gone to Santa Fe the following week, a 2-day ride, and had come back with a letter from a territorial attorney named Mr. Vance, who had reviewed the deed and water rights documentation, and confirmed that the double L's claim was unambiguous, and that any attempt by Cross's combine to dispute the boundary or divert the water would meet with immediate legal challenge. Cross had made one more visit after that, and Cyrus had stood on his porch and spoken to him quietly and without visible agitation, and Cross had ridden away and had not come back. It was during Cyrus's absence in Santa Fe that Birdie had her own private reckoning. She had been alone with the children for 2 days, which was the first time she had been solely responsible for them without Cyrus in the adjacent field or room. She had found it surprisingly natural, this total responsibility, had navigated Ruth's opinions about bedtime and Henry's passionate objection to having his hair combed, and a minor incident involving a chicken that had gotten into the kitchen, all with a steadiness she had not known she possessed. She had sat up on the second night after the children were in bed and looked around the kitchen, at the worn table and the good fire and the thin curtains, and had thought, "This is mine." Not in the sense of ownership, but in the sense of belonging. This is the place I belong, and she had thought, and I am falling in love with him. She had held the thought up and examined it honestly, without the reflex flinching she had developed since Thomas Waller. She had asked herself whether it was real or merely gratitude, whether it was attachment or desperation, whether it was the situation making her feel something she would not otherwise feel. And she had concluded, with the same honest rigor she applied to everything, that it was none of those things. It was the man himself. It was his quietness and his honesty and his grief that he did not use as an excuse. It was the way he had held her hand for just a moment in the lamplight. It was the gray at his temples and the lines at the corners of his eyes and the way he said her name, which he had begun using a few weeks into her arrival, simply Birdie, said in his low, even voice, and every time she heard it she felt something in her chest that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. She had fallen in love with him, and she did not know what to do about it because he had not offered her love. He had offered her a household and a purpose and the needs of his children. He had been warm and honest and grateful. But there had been no declaration, no indication that what was between them was anything other than the mutual regard of two people trying to make a sensible arrangement work. She had resolved to say nothing, to continue as she was, to pour everything into the children and the household and the life they were building together in the most practical sense, and to keep the rest of it private, in the same interior space where she had always kept the things she wanted most. She had kept this resolution for approximately 12 days after Cyrus returned from Santa Fe. What broke it was not anything she had planned. It was an accident of weather and circumstance and the particular vulnerability that comes from two people being stuck in a small space together when neither of them has anywhere else to be. A November storm had come down from the mountains with unusual ferocity, bringing 3 days of cold rain that kept everyone inside. The children had been fractious, and then inventive in their entertainment, and then fractious again. By the third evening they were both in bed early, exhausted from the weather-borne restlessness, and Cyrus and Birdie had found themselves alone in the kitchen with no particular purpose other than to wait out the rain. Cyrus had gotten out a book from his study, which surprised her because she had not known he read for pleasure, and she had asked about it, and he had said it was a collection of Longfellow's poetry, which surprised her further, and she had said she had read it, and one thing had led to another, and they had spent an hour talking about books and what they meant, and where he had gotten the reading habit from his mother, he said, who had been a schoolteacher in Texas before she married, and where she had gotten hers. From the boarding house matron's shelf, she said, the one good thing the woman had provided. They had discovered in the course of this conversation that they thought about things with remarkable similarity. Not that they agreed on everything, they did not, but that they approached the world with the same fundamental orientation, a preference for honesty over comfort, a deep distrust of pretense, a willingness to sit with difficult questions rather than closing them off with easy answers. The conversation had moved from books to childhood to beliefs, to what they each thought happened after a person died, which was a large and serious question for a rainy evening, but had felt entirely natural in the context of everything they had already said. At some point the lamp had burned low and Birdie had gotten up to trim the wick, and when she sat back down she had sat, without thinking, closer than before, and Cyrus had not moved away. They had been sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm beside hers, and neither of them was talking anymore, and the rain was still coming down and the fire was low and red, and Birdie had thought, "I cannot go on like this." She had turned to him and said, "Cyrus, I need to tell you something." He had turned to look at her, and they were very close, and something in his face had changed. Something had opened in it, and she had thought, "He already knows." "I think," she began, and then stopped, because the words she had prepared seemed entirely inadequate. She tried again. "I came here for practical reasons. I understood this was a practical arrangement. I want you to know that I still understand that. But I would be lying if I said that what I feel when I'm here, what I feel when I'm with you and with the children, is only practical." She met his eyes. "I would be lying if I said I don't think about you in ways that go well beyond what was in that advertisement." The silence afterward was not like the other silences. It was charged. It was the silence of the moment just before something breaks open. Cyrus put his hand on the side of her face, very carefully, the way you touch something you are afraid of damaging, and he said, "Birdie," just her name, in that voice. And it was the most eloquent thing she had ever heard. She turned her face into his hand without deciding to. He made a low sound in his throat, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, gently and then not so gently, with the particular quality of someone who has been holding something back for a very long time and has finally stopped. When they drew apart they looked at each other in the low firelight, and Birdie thought she had never in her life felt so completely seen. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "I didn't think it was fair to ask it of you. You came here for the children." "I came here for the children," she agreed. "And then I stayed because of you." He exhaled, a long, slow release of something held too long. Then he smiled, and it was the first full, unguarded smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face entirely, made him look younger and less defended and startlingly beautiful in his way, and Birdie felt something settle in her, some great internal realignment, as if everything that had been tilted slightly off for years had found its level. He said, "I think I would like to actually marry you, not for the advertisement, for myself." She said, "I think I would like that too." They had been married in Cimarron 3 weeks later, at the little church on the east side of town, in a ceremony that was small and plain and attended by a few of Cyrus's neighboring ranchers and their wives, and by the children, Ruth in her best dress looking grave and important, Henry holding Birdie's hand throughout the entire ceremony with both of his, as if he intended to secure her to himself permanently and was not leaving this to chance. The minister had pronounced them husband and wife, and Cyrus had kissed her, a proper kiss, brief but real, and Ruth had said, with the straightforward honesty that was her signature, "You may stop now, it's done," which had caused a ripple of laughter through the small congregation, and Henry had tugged at Birdie's hand and said, very clearly, the most words Birdie had heard him produce at one time, "Now you won't go away." Birdie had knelt down right there in the church and taken Henry's face in her hands and said, "No, sweetheart, I am not going anywhere, I promise you." Henry had seemed to consider this and then, satisfied, had nodded and let her stand up again. Life after the wedding had the quality of something finally moving at its natural pace. Not without difficulty, not without the ongoing negotiation of two full personalities sharing a life, but with a foundation of genuine love beneath the practical architecture of it, and that love made the difficulties manageable in a way they would not have been otherwise. Birdie had taken to the ranch life with an enthusiasm that surprised her, had learned to ride with Cyrus's patient teaching, had learned to handle the kitchen garden through the long growing season, had learned the rhythms of the cattle work well enough to be useful during the spring calving, which was hard and cold and miraculous in equal measure. She had continued teaching Ruth at home, and Ruth had turned out to be exceptionally bright, the kind of student who devoured everything put in front of her and came back demanding more, which had given Birdie a kind of professional satisfaction she had not expected to find here. Henry had blossomed. It had not happened overnight but steadily, like something growing toward light. By the spring he was talking in full sentences, animated and curious, and Birdie had sometimes caught Cyrus watching his son with an expression of such undisguised joy that she had to look away to contain her own emotion. The guilt Cyrus had described, the dark irrational guilt of the man who survived when another did not, had begun to lift, she thought. Not gone entirely, grief never fully departed, but no longer the dominant presence it had been. He talked about Clara sometimes now, carefully and honestly, letting the children hear her name and her stories, letting her be a real person in the household rather than a hidden wound. One evening in the spring, Cyrus had taken the old family portrait of Clara from the drawer where he had kept it and hung it on the parlor wall, and Ruth had stood looking at it for a long time and then said, very quietly, "I remember her better now." And Henry had looked at the portrait and then at Birdie and had said, with the devastating simplicity of a 5-year-old, "I have two mothers," and no one had disagreed with him because it was perfectly true. Birdie had written a letter to the boarding house in Kansas City where she had grown up, not because she had any particular affection for the place, but because she felt, for the first time, that she was no longer defined by the things she had lacked. She was defining herself now by what she had, and what she had was so full and various and real that she wanted to record it somewhere outside her own mind. The letter had gone unanswered, which she had expected, but the writing of it had been its own resolution. The summer brought heat and the good, busy difficulty of the ranch at full operation, and it brought something else, something Birdie had hoped for and tried not to hope too hard for, in the way she had learned to be careful with her deepest wishes. She had told Cyrus on a July evening, sitting on the wide porch after the children were in bed, with the last light going golden over the mountains and the river making its constant soft sound below the valley, told him in a quiet voice with her hands in her lap that she was going to have a baby. He had been very still for a moment. Then he had turned to her with an expression that combined joy and fear in equal measure, the natural response of a man who had lost his wife in exactly this circumstance, and she had reached out and taken his hand before he could begin to be afraid and said, "I know what you're thinking. We will get a proper doctor from Santa Fe well before the time comes, and he will be here with me, and it will be all right. I am strong and healthy, and we are going to be all right." He had looked at her hand holding his, and then at her face, and the fear had not disappeared because that was too much to ask of it, but it had moved to the side to make room for the joy, and he had pulled her close and pressed his mouth against her hair and said her name in a way that was both a thank you and a plea and an expression of love too large for any other words. The pregnancy had progressed through the summer and fall without incident. Birdie had been sick in the mornings for the first 2 months and had managed it with the pragmatic stoicism that was her nature, and Cyrus had been quietly attentive in ways she found more touching than any grand gesture, making sure there was always warm water ready in the mornings, taking on more of the household lifting without comment, riding to Cimarron to bring back whatever the doctor in town prescribed. Ruth had been fascinated by the pregnancy in a deeply scientific and unsentimental way, asking highly technical questions that Birdie answered as honestly as a 6-year-old's comprehension permitted. Henry had simply accepted it with the same trusting faith he extended to most things, and had taken to patting Birdie's increasingly round belly with a proprietorial satisfaction that made Cyrus laugh out loud, which was still, 6 months into their marriage, the most wonderful sound she knew. The doctor had come from Santa Fe in November, a careful and experienced man named Dr. Aldrich, and he had been impressed with Birdie's constitution and had said everything was proceeding exactly as it should. He had agreed, at Cyrus's request and his own professional agreement with the wisdom of it, to remain at the Double L as the time approached, and he had stayed for the last week of November in the guest room off the kitchen, playing chess with Cyrus in the evenings and charming Ruth with accounts of his time in Mexico City. The baby arrived on the 4th of December, 1883, in the blue hour before dawn, with a winter wind talking against the windows and a fire roaring in the bedroom, and Dr. Aldrich doing his work with quiet efficiency and Cyrus holding Birdie's hand through the entire labor in a way that made her feel, even in the hardest moments of it, absolutely not alone. It was a boy. A healthy, loud, supremely indignant boy with a full head of dark hair and Birdie's particular shape of eyes, which Cyrus identified immediately and with visible delight. They named him Thomas, not after Thomas Waller, not to honor that betrayal, but because Birdie's father's name had been Thomas, the father who had gone west and never returned, and she thought it seemed right to make something new from the old wound, to reclaim the name and fill it with something better. When Ruth and Henry were allowed in to see the baby that morning, Ruth had examined him with the focused attention of a naturalist and declared him acceptably formed. Henry had looked at him with enormous reverent eyes and then whispered to Birdie, "Is he mine?" "He is absolutely yours," she had said. Henry had then turned to his father and said, with the gravity of someone conveying important official information, "Papa, we have a baby." Cyrus, who had been awake all night and was sitting at the edge of the bed with the look of a man who has been through fire and come out the other side into somewhere unexpectedly beautiful, had said, "Yes, son, we do." The months after Thomas's birth were the fullest and most demanding and most joyful of Birdie's life, which she had not thought possible given how full and demanding and joyful the preceding year had been. Thomas was a good baby, which she attributed partly to luck and partly to the constant attentive company of two older siblings who wanted to hold him approximately twice as often as it was advisable. But he was also a baby, which meant that a good portion of every night was negotiated, and the particular sweetness of exhaustion that comes from loving someone so much you don't really mind. Cyrus had been wonderful. She had not been surprised because she knew him by now, knew his capacity for patient and devoted care, but she had been moved repeatedly by specific small instances of it. He had gotten up in the night when he heard her struggling, had taken the baby without comment, and walked the floor for an hour so she could sleep. He had negotiated with Ruth about her volume indoors without being asked. He had taught Henry to fish in the spring, a project requiring more patience than most professional endeavors, and Henry had caught his first fish and been so overwhelmed by the achievement that he had cried with happiness, which had made Cyrus pick him up and hold him the way he did not always do, the demonstrations of physical affection being something Cyrus was still learning after years of keeping himself contained. It was in the spring of 1884, Thomas being 4 months old and the range coming green along the river again, that Birdie had her one true confrontation with the past. A letter had arrived, which was unusual because they did not receive much mail. It was addressed to her in a handwriting she did not recognize, and it was postmarked from a town in Missouri. She had opened it at the kitchen table with Thomas asleep in his basket beside her, and what she had read had made her sit very still for a long moment. The letter was from a man named James Shelton, her father. He was alive. He was in Missouri. He had remarried and had a family. He had learned, through some chain of inquiry she could not trace, that she had married and was living in New Mexico territory, and he had written to say that he wanted her to know he thought of her, that he had made mistakes, that he was not asking for her forgiveness, but that he wanted her to know he was sorry. The letter was 4 pages long and carefully written, and honest in a way that made it worse and better simultaneously. He had described himself plainly and without excuse. He had said that he had left when she was 7 because he had been a coward who could not face the grief of his wife's death and the responsibility of a small child, and that he had known even then that it was wrong and had never been able to live entirely comfortably with it. Birdie had sat with that letter for a long time. Cyrus had come in and seen her face and asked quietly what had happened, and she had handed him the letter and watched him read it. He had set it down and looked at her and waited. That was what he did when she needed to think. He waited and let her think. She had said eventually, "He's alive." "Yes," he said. "He left me," she said. "He just left." "He did," Cyrus said, without either excusing it or inflaming it. "I spent my whole childhood waiting for him to come back," Birdie said, and her voice was very steady, which was how she knew the emotion was very deep. "I told myself every year that he would come back, and then I stopped telling myself that." Cyrus had moved then to the chair beside her, not taking her hand, just being beside her, which was what she needed. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," he said. She had looked at him. "What would you do?" He had thought honestly about it, which was always what he did with her questions, treated them as real questions deserving real consideration. He said, "I would probably write back. Not to forgive him or to welcome him into my life, but because I would want him to know that I turned out all right without him, that I built a life, that his leaving did not define me." Birdie had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "That is exactly what I want." She had written the letter that evening. It had taken 3 drafts, not because she was uncertain about what she felt, but because she was precise about how she said things. She had said that she had received his letter and had read it carefully, that she did not wish him harm, that she bore him no particular malice at this distance, that she had spent years shaped by the absence he had left, but that she had not been broken by it, and that she was now a married woman with a family of her own, 3 children, 2 by circumstance and 1 by birth, on a cattle ranch in New Mexico territory, and that her life was full and good. She had said that she did not think she wanted a relationship with him, not out of anger, but out of the recognition that they were strangers with a biological connection, but not a real one, and that she thought starting one at this point would be more complicated than either of them needed. She had wished him well and signed it Birdie Langston. She had been Birdie Langston for 5 months, and it still struck her with a small internal resonance every time she wrote it. She had sent the letter and then done something she had not expected to do. She had cried. A long, quiet, thorough cry in the bedroom with the door closed, the kind that has nothing to do with the present and everything to do with clearing out something that has been lodged for years. Cyrus had knocked on the door after a while and come in and sat beside her on the bed and held her while she finished, without saying anything, without trying to make it smaller than it was, just holding her. Afterward she had felt, genuinely, as if something had healed. Not the original wound that would always carry its scar, but the infection around it, the suppurated grief that had never fully drained. It had drained now. She felt clean in a way she had not expected. She did not hear from her father again, and she found that she did not mind. The summer of 1884 was a good one. Thomas was thriving, sitting up and grabbing at everything with the focused purpose of a determined scientist, and Ruth had taken on the project of his education with the same intensity she brought to everything, reading to him from her own primers with a gravity that suggested she took the long-term project of his intellectual development very seriously. Henry had come alive in ways that still moved Birdie to tears if she let herself think about it too directly, had developed a particular gift for working with horses that Cyrus recognized and was quietly, deliberately cultivating, spending long afternoons at the corral with his son, in a companionship that seemed to do them both good. Birdie had found herself thinking, in the long evenings when the children were in bed and she and Cyrus sat together on the porch or at the kitchen table, about the shape of the life they had built and marveling at it. Not because it was extraordinary in any outward sense. It was the life of a ranching family in the New Mexico territory, which was hard work and plain living, and the perpetual uncertainty of weather and markets, and the 1,000 other things that could go wrong between the beginning and end of any year. But it was hers, wholly and completely, the first thing in her life that had been truly hers. There was a particular evening in August. Thomas asleep in his basket on the porch, Henry and Ruth having been put to bed with the specific negotiation required for a warm summer evening when sleep seemed less urgent than the beauty of the night sky. When Cyrus and Birdie had sat on the porch steps watching the stars come out over the mountains, and Cyrus had said, out of a long and comfortable silence, "Are you happy?" She had thought about the question because she always thought about his questions and had said, "I am happy in a way I didn't know was available to me." He had turned to look at her and said, "What do you mean?" She had tried to find the words. "I knew happiness as a child, I think. The kind children have when things are all right, easy and immediate. And then I knew the absence of it for a long time. I knew the kind of contentment that comes from managing your life adequately and not being in pain. But this," she looked at the mountains, at the river glinting in the last light below them, at the lamp burning in the kitchen window, at Thomas's sleeping face. "This is something larger than what I thought happiness was. I thought happiness was the absence of sorrow. This is more like the presence of everything good at once." Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know exactly what you mean." She had looked at him and said, "Do you remember what you said that first evening in the kitchen? After I arrived, you said you had made a kind of peace with quiet." "I remember." "I don't think you need the peace anymore," she said softly. "I think you're just quiet now because it suits you. The grief is different now, isn't it?" He had been honest with her as he always was. He said, "Yes, it will always be there what happened with Clara, but it is," he paused, "it's become part of the whole." Not the whole itself. She had nodded because she understood this completely. She had reached over and taken his hand in the dark, and he had laced his fingers through hers with the naturalness of long habit, and they had sat there watching the stars until the night was fully dark and Thomas woke and wanted feeding, and the ordinary miracle of the evening concluded. In the fall of 1884, Ruth turned 8, and she announced at her birthday supper, with the confidence of someone conveying a thoroughly considered position, that she had decided she wanted to become a doctor. Cyrus had raised his eyebrows, not with discouragement but with the particular expression of a man recalibrating. Birdie had said, "That is an excellent plan. You will need more mathematics." Ruth had said, "I know. Will you teach me?" Birdie had said she would. Cyrus had said to Ruth, "Your grandmother was a schoolteacher, on your mother's side." This was the first time he had offered the children a fact about Clara's family unprompted. "She was the smartest person I ever knew until I met your new mother. I think it must be something that runs in the women around this family." Ruth had processed this information with characteristic thoroughness and then said, "So being smart comes from both sides?" "Seems like," Cyrus said. Henry, who was 6 now and had developed the rancher's instinct early and deeply, had said, "I'm going to have the best horse ranch in New Mexico." And then looked at Thomas, who at 10 months was attempting to introduce a piece of birthday cake to his left ear, and added generously, "Thomas can work on it too." The year turned to 1885, and Birdie found the days acquiring a depth and richness that she sometimes had to stop and simply hold for a moment, the way you stop in good light to let it fall on you. She and Cyrus had settled into a partnership of such complete and practiced coherence that she sometimes caught herself mid-thought knowing exactly what he would say about a thing before he said it. Not because they had become identical to each other. They had remained themselves, distinct and in many ways contrasting, but because they had learned each other's shapes so completely that they fit together without effort. She loved him in the way she had hoped to love someone since she was a girl reading novels by lamplight in the boarding house, not with the consuming anxiety of romantic uncertainty, but with a deep and grounded certainty, the love that says, "You are the fixed point around which everything else orients." And she knew he loved her. He had told her many times by then, in the direct, undecorated way that was entirely his own. But she knew it also in his watching, in the way he woke early and made sure the stove was lit before she rose, in the way he talked to her about the ranch as an equal partner in every decision, in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and put his arms around her from behind just to hold her for a moment, for no reason other than that he wanted to, and that was the most eloquent love letter she had ever received. Spring of 1885 brought one more surprise. Birdie had known, even before she was certain, by the particular quality of the mornings in February, the way the kitchen smelled different to her, the way she was tired in the afternoons. She had told Cyrus on a Sunday evening, and he had been this time simply glad, the fear not entirely absent but much smaller than before, contained by everything they had come through together, by the evidence of Thomas sleeping soundly upstairs, by the 18 months of good solid marriage behind them. He had said, "Boy or girl, I don't care." She had said, "I want a girl this time. Henry already told me he thinks it should be a girl." Cyrus had laughed. "Henry is 6. He thinks the new calf should be named Gerald." "Gerald is an excellent name," Birdie said firmly. He had laughed again, that full and unguarded laugh that still made her feel the same thing it had the first time she heard it, and he had pulled her close, and she had put her head against his chest and listened to his heart, steady and real, and thought, "I have everything I ever wanted. I have everything and more." The summer was warm and full. Thomas turned to and began walking with the determined and slightly precarious confidence of someone who has recently discovered locomotion and has not yet fully accounted for the limitations of terrain. Henry taught him to feed the horses apples over the fence with an authority that suggested Henry found teaching highly satisfying. Ruth continued her education with Birdie, had moved well beyond what Birdie had taught the older children in her Kansas City schoolteacher years, and Birdie had written to a woman she knew in Santa Fe, a retired teacher from a higher institution back east, to ask about the advanced primers and mathematical texts that would serve Ruth's ambitions. The woman had sent a package of books that Ruth had received like Christmas in August, carrying them to her room and spending 3 consecutive evenings reading straight through them. Birdie had watched her daughter, this child who had not come from her body but had come from her heart, and had thought about how love was not a finite resource that ran out when distributed widely, but something that grew with use, that the more she loved the more she had to give, that Ruth and Henry and Thomas and Cyrus had not divided her capacity for love but multiplied it. The baby came in October, on the ranch, with Dr. Aldrich again in attendance at Cyrus's insistence and Birdie's willing agreement, a good and straightforward labor, and when it was done and the doctor placed the child in Birdie's arms, she looked at the small red face and the angry, astonished eyes, and she said, without looking away from the baby, "Well," Cyrus, at her side, his hand in hers, said, "A girl." Ruth, who had been allowed to wait outside the door, knocked immediately upon hearing the cry and was admitted and came to the side of the bed and looked at her new sister with an expression of genuine and unguarded tenderness, a side of Ruth that appeared in these specific and undefended moments and that Birdie treasured every time she saw it. "She's very small," Ruth said. "You were 2 once," Cyrus said. "Was I?" Ruth seemed to find this surprising, as if she had been born fully formed at her current level of competence. Henry had looked at the baby with round eyes and said, in a half-whisper, "She has red hair." She did. Clara's copper-red hair, come back in this new child. And when Birdie had looked at Cyrus, she had seen his expression, the grief and the gratitude and the love all present together in his face, this man who had learned to hold everything at once. They named her Alina, after no one in particular, only because when they said it aloud in the birth room it sounded right, and Ruth immediately shortened it to Nell, and Henry called her Nell for approximately 1 day, and then began calling her Little Red for reasons that were self-evident, and the name Little Red stuck with a permanence that had by Christmas been accepted by everyone including Dr. Aldrich, who had never met a child he could not assign a nickname to. Christmas of 1885 at the Double L Ranch was a thing of particular abundance. Not material abundance. The gifts were modest by any Eastern measure, but the kind that comes from a table full of people who belong to each other. Cyrus had gotten a pine tree from the high country on the mountain and brought it back in the wagon, and Ruth and Henry and Thomas, who was not yet fully cognizant of the traditions but enthusiastically participatory, had decorated it with paper chains and a string of dried berries and the small colored glass ornaments that had been Clara's, brought out from the trunk in the attic with careful deliberation. Birdie had cooked for 2 days, had produced a dinner of improbable complexity given the limited equipment, had made an apple cake from the dried apples she had put up in the fall, and had set the table with the good cloth that was reserved for significant occasions, and had stood back and looked at it and felt something too large for any single word. They had eaten together, all 6 of them, Ruth at 12 fully capable of carrying a sophisticated adult conversation, Henry at 9 responsible and quietly proud, Thomas at 2 magnificently determined to have the drumstick he had identified as his rightful portion, Nell at 3 months sleeping serenely through the entire proceeding in her basket near the fire in the blissful indifference of infancy. Cyrus had made a toast which was unusual and therefore notable, had raised his coffee cup and looked around the table and said, simply and entirely sufficiently, "To all of us." Birdie had raised her cup and met his eyes and said, "To all of us." After dinner, after the children were in bed and Nell was fed and settled, Birdie and Cyrus had sat by the fire in the parlor with 2 cups of the good coffee she had gotten from Cimarron, and Clara's portrait on the wall above them, and the Christmas tree still lit with its small lamp in the corner, and the whole house full of the quiet of sleeping children. Cyrus had said, after a long, warm silence, "I want to tell you something." She had looked at him, this man she knew so well and loved so completely, and said, "Tell me." He said, "When I wrote that advertisement, I was doing the most calculated and pragmatic thing I had ever done. I told myself I was doing it for the children. That what I needed was someone capable, someone honest, someone who would look after Ruth and Henry with real care. I told myself that was the beginning and end of it. I told myself I wasn't looking for love because I wasn't sure I believed I deserved it again. That having had Clara and lost her was the portion allotted to me and I had used it up." Birdie was very still, listening. He said, "And then you stepped off that train." A pause. The fire shifted. "And you knelt down in the church," he said, "and told Henry you weren't going anywhere, and you held him when he cried, and you stood up in my kitchen when Cross came and said, 'We won't let them.' And you sat with me in the lamplight and told me the truth about yourself when you didn't have to. And every single thing you did taught me that I was wrong, that I hadn't used up my portion, that what I had with Clara was real and true and nothing ever changes that, but that love is not a finite thing that gets used up, that there was more of it." He paused again, turned to look at her directly. "That there was you." Birdie felt the tears come, which she did not try to prevent. She said, "Cyrus Langston." He said, "Birdie Langston." She said, "I came west on a train with 1 trunk and a secret I'd been keeping my whole life, that I wanted a family more than I had ever wanted anything. And I was afraid of that wanting because the things I'd wanted before had either been taken from me or had never been real in the first place. And then this," she gestured, a small motion that encompassed the house and the fire and the sleeping children and the portrait on the wall and him, all of him. "All of this turned out to be exactly as real as anything I had ever feared to want." He leaned forward and put his arms around her, and she put her face against his neck, and they sat together in the firelight of Christmas night with their house full, and their children sleeping, and the mountains keeping their patient watch outside the window, and the world was very still and very good. The years that followed added their layers of richness to the life they had built. Thomas grew into a boy of fierce intelligence and considerable stubbornness who was, Birdie privately thought, the person most like herself that she had ever met, which explained both why she understood him perfectly and why he occasionally drove her to the end of her patience. He was gentle with animals and hard on his own mistakes, and loyal to his brother and sisters with a completeness that moved her every time she saw it in action. He had Cyrus's serious eyes and Birdie's particular way of going quiet when something mattered to him most. Ruth, true to her stated ambitions, had by the time she was 14 consumed every science and mathematics text that Birdie could procure from Santa Fe, and was writing letters to schools back east to understand what path a woman might take toward medicine. The responses were mixed, because 1888 was not a time when such paths were wide open to women, but Ruth was not a person easily deterred by structural barriers, and Birdie had taken considerable private satisfaction in having raised a daughter who met injustice with calculation rather than resignation. Henry had his horses. The Double L had acquired a reputation in the territory for the quality of its stock, in no small part because Henry at 10 had a natural intuition for horse management that left experienced men twice his age standing at the corral fence asking questions. Cyrus had begun including him in the breeding decisions, which Henry accepted with the gravity of a senior partner. Nell grew into a person of wild and glorious energy and copper hair, and a laugh that could be heard across 3 fields, who was the particular joy of all of them and took advantage of this position with cheerful expertise. She had at 3 developed an attachment to the old ranch dog, a substantial mixed-breed animal named General, that was so absolute that General had essentially become her shadow, and the sight of Nell and General moving through the ranch yard together, Nell narrating her thoughts aloud and General listening with the air of someone who took the information very seriously, was a source of consistent happiness to Birdie. Birdie herself had found in these years a dimension of her life she had not anticipated. The ranching community of the Cimarron Valley was not large, but it was real, and she had become known within it not only as Cyrus Langston's wife, but as a woman of considerable resource and intelligence in her own right. She had started a school in Cimarron proper, a proper one, working with the town council to establish a building and a curriculum, drawing on her years of teaching and her continuing education of Ruth and Henry and Thomas at home. It had taken the better part of 2 years to get it established, and another year before it had the student population to justify its full operation. But by 1888, it was a functioning school with a real building and 2 teachers, Birdie being one of them. Cyrus had watched this project unfold with the particular expression he got when he was very proud and choosing not to make a large demonstration of it. And one evening when she had come home tired and satisfied from a particularly good day of teaching and found supper already on the table, he had said, very simply, "The territory is better for what you're doing." She had looked at him and said, "It's what I always knew how to do. It just took a while to find the right place for it." He had nodded, and she had known from his expression that he was thinking about the advertisement, about the plainness of what he had offered, and that he was still occasionally quietly astonished by what had grown from such an unadorned beginning. She had gone to him and put her hands on either side of his face and made him look at her and said, because she wanted him to hear it clearly, "I have everything I have ever wanted and more than I knew to want. You gave me that." He had covered her hands with his and said, "We gave each other that." On a spring morning in 1889, with New Mexico territory on the verge of statehood discussions and the world turning in its great slow way toward change, Birdie Langston stood on the porch of the Double L Ranch and watched her family move through the morning in the particular configurations of long habit and deep love. Cyrus was at the corral with Henry, talking quietly over the fence about one of the mares. Ruth was at the kitchen table with her books, preparing a letter to a women's medical college in Philadelphia that had been accepting female students since 1850, a piece of information Birdie had spent considerable effort obtaining for her. Thomas was in the yard with Nell, who at 3½ was explaining to him something of great apparent urgency involving a beetle and a stick, and Thomas, who was 6 now, was listening with the careful attention he gave to Nell's concerns because he was that kind of boy. Birdie stood on the porch and felt the morning sun on her face and heard the river below and the cottonwoods in the early wind and smelled the coffee she had left on the stove. And she thought about the woman who had stood on a train platform in Cimarron 7 years ago with one trunk and a secret, and a heart full of careful, frightened hope. She thought about what that woman had wanted, and how she had been afraid of wanting it, and how she had come west anyway, and how every single difficult and uncertain and frightening step of the way had led here, to this morning, to this porch, to this life that was so full she sometimes stood still in the middle of it simply to take it all in. Cyrus looked up from the corral and saw her standing there and lifted one hand, the brief gesture of a man accustomed to not having to say much, and she lifted hers back, and across the distance of the yard in the morning, with their children moving between them, they looked at each other with the full and settled knowledge of two people who have found the thing they did not know they were looking for, and have had the courage and the grace to keep it. She had always wanted a family. He had needed a mother for his children. And from that plain and practical beginning, they had built something so far beyond the advertisement, so much larger and realer and more beautiful than anything either of them had dared to want, that the distance between what they had hoped for and what they had received was itself a kind of miracle. The morning light came over the mountains in long gold bars. The river talked. The cottonwoods shook their leaves in the early wind. General the dog lay in the sun by the porch steps with the complete satisfaction of a creature who has found exactly the right life. Thomas was helping Nell find another beetle. Henry was laughing at something his father had said, the same laugh as his father, low and real and unhurried. Ruth, inside, turned a page. Birdie Langston breathed in the morning and felt it fill her to her edges, this woman who had been so long without and who now had so much, and she thought, this is what it means to arrive. This is what it means to finally, fully, irrevocably belong somewhere. She stepped back through the kitchen door and the warmth of the stove met her, and the smell of the coffee and the sound of Ruth turning pages, and she was home, and she was loved. And the family she had always wanted was all around her, and everything that had been hidden and feared and kept back for safekeeping had been given, at last, its full and rightful welcome into the light.